students today, and I don't see this going away, are thinking about the major issues that are impacting society, whether that's climate change, whether that's LGBTQ rights, whether that's rights of women. That is coming up in the classroom all the time in relation to companies and how companies handle and talk about these issues. So I thought of myself in my teens and 20s as an activist, but nothing like these generations that are coming up. And they're not separating it as this is not something I'm going to talk about at work or at school. It is literally a part of who they are and how they present and how they come to the world. So that's the first thing, right? It is dynamic in the classroom right now.
Welcome to the Warriors at Work show. This is Jeanie Coomber, your guide and host. This is a show for men and women in the workplace who want to move from the predictable to the potent. This is your weekly dose of inspiration with an edge. I talk with CEOs and shamans, sports marketing executives and therapists. All of us are like-minded thinkers and doers who tell stories, share wisdom, and challenge each other to have the best life possible inside and outside the office. Welcome to your Warrior Conversation.
Hey everybody, it's Jeanie. Thank you so much for joining me at the Warriors at Work show. Hey, all of my Gen Xers. Yeah, you and I are Gen Xers. And this conversation is all about how we are uniquely positioned to help the future of work. I got to sit down and spend some time with Wendy Zajack. She spent a majority of her working career working for large global organizations. She pivoted and joined Georgetown as a faculty director and professor for the Integrated Marketing Communications program in the School of Continuing Studies. And she has incredible insight into a lot of things inside and outside the classroom. But what we really started to dig into is what could we be doing in our particular generation as Gen Xers to really move discussion, behaviors, insights, ways of being forward as we consider what the workplace is going to look like over the course of the next months, years to come. This was such a fun and insightful conversation, and I know it's going to be tremendously helpful to all of you leaders out there that are thinking about what the next iteration of the workplace is going to look like. Enjoy. Wendy, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. I cannot wait to talk to you about the future of work. I so appreciate you lending me your insight, your heart, and very excited for this conversation.
Me too. I can't wait.
So where I want to start is because your story is so fascinating. You're a very seasoned marketer and branding executive who decided to go into academia. So please tell us that story.
Yeah. So I think like many people that get sort of, I don't know, maybe we're mid-career, end of career. I started to think about, okay, what do I want the last section of my career to be? And guess what? It wasn't dealing with corporate executives yelling at me. Not that they all yelled, but, telling me I needed to do this or that. And I started to I wanted something more meaningful. And I think a lot of us, I find a lot of my faculty that teach for me end up in the same space, right? We're thinking about what the future is going to be. So I was in the middle of a corporate merger, and I thought, I've been through one international merger before, so I'm really thinking about what's next. I see a job board posting for real, for Georgetown. And I thought, you know what? I've always wanted to teach. I've always wanted to do this. I'm going to apply and see what happens. And lots of different things happen. They called me in for an interview. They said, we don't think
Were your colleagues like, what are you doing? What are you, crazy?
I don't even think I told anyone because I was so afraid that it wouldn't happen. It wouldn't be worked out. I think it was like my dream of dreams, and where you secretly kind of like, oh, I'm going to just apply and see what happens. I think it's interesting when I finally interviewed there and I ended up getting the job I have now. So it took a couple month process. And I told people the most interesting thing is they all were like, that sounds like a perfect fit for you. So
Wild.
I think people saw it within me and I didn't see it within myself, if that makes sense.
I mean, that took a lot of courage to do an about face from something that you were entrenched in, and obviously were delivering and having a lot of impact but to follow your heart and your soul on something completely different.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I was just telling someone today, it was the most scared I've been in a job interview. In whatever, maybe since my first job interview, right? I went in, I was thinking, I felt like an imposter. Haven't felt like an imposter in a long time. And but I knew it was right because I cared so much about the interview. I actually practiced. So I had to give a teaching demo. And I mean, I've given presentations, probably like a lot of communicators and marketers, in your sleep, coaching, all that kind of stuff. And I actually rehearsed. I did what I tell people to do. And that's when I knew I really, really cared.
Yeah.
And so if the job didn't happen, I knew I had to make it happen somehow.
Wow, I love that.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about, obviously, your primary focus at Georgetown is with graduate students and helping them to really strengthen their skills and how they think about marketing and branding and communications. And you have some really powerful ideas that I want to dig into. But I want to first talk about it on a broader perspective, because we're really going to be talking about all these things through the lens of like, what is the future of work? How can we influence that narrative? What are the topics of conversation that are coming up in the classroom at Georgetown right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it mirrors the topics of conversation that are coming up around the kitchen table as well, just in a slightly different way. So students today, and I don't see this going away, are thinking about the major issues that are impacting society, whether that's climate change, whether that's LGBTQ rights, whether that's rights of women. That is coming up in the classroom all the time in relation to companies and how companies handle and talk about these issues. So I thought of myself in my teens and 20s as an activist, but nothing like these generations that are coming up. And they're not separating it as, this is not something I'm going to talk about at work or at school. It is literally a part of who they are and how they present and how they come to the world. So that's the first thing, right? It is dynamic in the classroom right now. It is scary in the classroom right now because, all these things that before, I think when I was growing up, were sort of partitioned, are now out there and being discussed and being addressed and being thought about. So that's one thing that we talk about a lot. And if you think about I've been in education for 6 years, the last 6 years, but even I could argue before that, we've seen brands and businesses doing all kinds of weird things, great things, terrible things. And so every time I say, wow, this has been an amazing month, there's so much to talk about, then we have another amazing month. And there's so much more to talk about. So I think the intersection of events and business has just merged in a way that I don't feel like I was thinking about as deeply when I was studying communications, in the early 90s.
So how do you from an academia perspective get your arms around these topics and have constructive, insightful, and evolving conversations so that they take these learnings wherever they're going? Because I'm imagining you're already you're talking to professionals that they're doing a degree, probably a lot of which outside of an existing career. But I'm sure you're talking to those that go right from undergrad right into grad. How do you get your arms around this in a way where
Yeah.
it's like meaningful and applicable?
Yeah, and I think that's the other, I mean, I think we're all aware of this. I read all the time.
Mm,
I read every little soundbite newsletter I can get my hands on so that when I'm walking into a classroom, I have a good idea of what's happening. You cannot, I think, be again separated from what's happening in the world today. So I try to read a broad base of sources. So I try not to limit myself to sort of one side or the other. Encourage my students to do the same. So I have to stay as a professor on top of it because
mhm.
someone is going to ask me if
Oh,
I
yeah.
saw brand X make this big mistake. I think the other thing I've also learned to do is, and this is hard, especially after years and years of communication and marketing training. I want to have an answer, but if I don't know what they're talking about, I ask.
Yeah.
I don't pretend to know anymore. I'm like, wait, what? What are you talking
Yeah.
about? And I think that's really important too, right? There are, I mean, now we're talking the age, I think our average age of student is 28. So I'm 51. So we're getting some separation
Mhm.
in ages, right? And so I'll be like, I don't know what you're saying. What are you explain that term, right? And I think this is also really important. And I think a classroom's great because I think we feel more open to say, like, wait, what social media thing are you looking at? How is that happening? So I'm much more comfortable, asking for
Mm.
what they're thinking of or to explain the situation to me. And I think that's really important in the classroom. The other thing is our students are super international and they're also really diverse. So they're coming from very different backgrounds. I grew up in the Midwest in the most homogenous, white Christian kind of community. And so I've also learned to just, that's my perspective, but to also try to understand where someone's coming from. And
Mm.
so I think also in the classroom, and again, we'll take this into the workplace, that empathy and that few minutes of let me make sure I understand what you're saying has proven, invaluable to me. I come from a different generation than these students, right? When I started working, I was in tech. I was often the only woman in the room. And so I developed sort of skills and techniques to get me through that time. And now my students are entering into a very different working world and working in a different working environment. And I have to check myself
Mm.
just as much as they have to check themselves. And
So
it's
true.
yeah, and it's I think it's humbling sometimes when you're in that environment and everybody's talking about something or laughing about something and you're like, okay, can someone back up? Or, and a lot of us have probably been in this, your listeners, you make a reference to something and no one has any idea what that is.
Mhm, mhm. Well, what you're really hitting on too is the giving time, attention, and patience to the idea of exploration. In our generation, which I know we're gonna talk about, being Gen Xers, we often find ourselves, well, based on our level of expertise and our experience and whatever resources we've used, and we often come from that place of sort of an absolute thinking mindset. And what you just articulated is this is a huge opportunity to start exercising more questions
Yes.
and challenge our own assumptions and our own lens on things.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I in kind of preparation for this, I was reading on, multi-generational conflict. And, there's some great research. It's always happened, right? You can always think about your grandparents saying, "Oh, when I was your age," or your parents, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's something we as humans do. And so it's a part of our growth. It's actually a part, and I find myself in this camp, we forget what we actually were like at that age. And so and I definitely, my husband and my kids will tell me this all the time. My college roommates tell me this. We put our older selves on top of our
Mm,
younger selves, our
so true.
sensibility. And
That's so
so,
true.
yeah. And so I think coming with an openness and understanding in the classroom, I think for me has really helped me thrive. And many times my adjuncts say this to me, and I 100% believe this myself. I get as much out of the teaching as my students do.
Mm.
I,
So,
I really do, because I'm taking away new ideas, new thinking. I'm challenging my thinking.
mhm.
Why do I think that? Why do I think that's the right way?
What's an example of a brand that you've seen, particularly over the last 3 years, right? Because we've just I don't need to say how insane the last 3 years have been, but, like, what's an example of a brand that's doing this type of work, that is iterating, that is shifting, that is evolving, and is playing in this exploratory space that really embodies what you're trying to, uh, share with your students?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually I'm kind of obsessed with this brand, because we had their marketing guy speak at in one of our classes, Nando Peri Peri, which is,
Oh.
for those who don't know it, and if you don't have a Nando, don't worry, they're coming across the US. It's a South African brand, a chicken company,
Hmm.
essentially. And they started in South Africa out of apartheid, or right around apartheid. And so they were at an incredibly difficult time in South Africa, and they had to figure out where they stood in all of that mess. Right? What were they
Mm.
going to be for? So baked into their brand literally is this spirit um of of activism, of having a brand voice. And they figured out what it was going to be for them early on. So the stuff that they're doing now in the US, again, they had to take this South African brand, very different sense of humor in South Africa. It has a very, very popular in the UK. And then mix that into the US, where some of that humor doesn't play, and figure
Mm.
out what they were going to stand for here. So in Washington, they decided they were going to do a lot of things around Black Lives Matter. Washington, D.C. is a very diverse community that mattered a lot to their employees. And so they dug in there. So I think it's cool how they've figured out which are the issues they should play in and
Mm.
which are the issues that they shouldn't, right? And finding out those dividing lines. I mean, the other one, US brand, is Ben and Jerry's. I mean, but they were born an activism
Right,
brand,
right,
right?
right.
And I think that it's been very natural for them to find those spaces that they can operate in and play in, even though they're an ice cream company, right? At the end of the day. But yeah, so I think the Ben and Jerry's brand has also been kind of iconic. And I think, when you think about big consumer brands, um, they're all navigating this right now.
Mm.
Coke, and we've seen the good and the bad of some of those. Figuring out where does a sub brand go in all of that, right? What's that going to be? What's that personality going to be? But it's challenging. It is
Mm.
so challenging, to figure out where those right steps are and where a brand where it should be. And I think the biggest advice I could give any company really is, you have to have conversations in advance. right? It's this, and it's multi-generational dialoguing.
Yes.
That,
And I think
again,
that's different than how we're programmed, because we're like,
yes.
well, I've got 30 years, so clearly I'm the authority in the room. And we have to challenge that thinking, and that's just not helpful.
Yeah. And I think I've really started, and I think education is a big piece of it, to think about DE&I as, and that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, about that in terms of even the age lens.
Oh,
Right.
that's
And
interesting.
I'm thinking about that when I'm thinking about hiring faculty. I'm thinking, do I have a good, diverse age profile? Because when I started to kind of look at the diversity of my faculty overall, guess what? They kind of looked a lot like me. They were my age, they were white, they tended to be women. And so I really started to think about, okay, well, I mean, a 40-year-old marketer is also great. And they grew up in a totally different time. What are they going to bring to the classroom? So again, really thinking through all of that and bringing all those experiences together. And you're right, we're programmed in a hierarchical way. Right? The senior person in the room knows a lot, and they do. I still think I know a lot, but it doesn't mean that I can't also learn and keep learning from other generations. And I think that's what we're going to have to do to succeed. I don't think that the sensibility of one generation is going to carry us through all this.
Yes. Well, that is a perfect segue, because I want to talk about this blog you wrote, which is 5 reasons why we, Generation X, were born to lead the entire workforce towards the next big thing. And you wrote something in here that just brought a huge smile on my face. And this caught my attention. You said, fellow Gen Xers, our time is now. I'm convinced we, and we alone, can help steer the world towards a brighter tomorrow. We are operating in challenging times. We are divided politically. We are facing some huge global issues around immigration, climate change, and some would argue our current economic models are failing. We know that advances in technology, particularly artificial intelligence, will lead us to a place that's unfamiliar, scary, and into uncharted waters. And you gave 5 key reasons, which I'm not going to pull out all 5. I actually pulled out my top 3, and I want you to comment. First reason why we are really central to this next iteration: we are free range kids. What the heck does that mean?
Yeah. And I mean, I think anyone, once I say it, you'll never be able to unhear it. I mean, we were the last generation that went outside and played until dinner, or in my case, beyond dinner, because I claimed I couldn't hear my mom yelling. Right. So we weren't tracked. We didn't have phones. We rode our bikes places. So, I think it's whatever I did, I had, from the time my mom kicked me out of the house until I needed to be home, I had free control over what I did and where I roamed. And, we was safe. I actually, there's a lot of studies done about, was it safer then than it is now? And a lot of people say it's pretty much the same. We can argue about that, but I think we had a sense of safety and security. We roamed around, we did our thing. We made our own agenda. And to me, this is one of the biggest differences I see between myself and the Gen X generation, and definitely my own kids and even my students, even some millennials that started to creep into, being kind of taken around, having schedules, having agendas, having play dates. I mean, my play date was knock on a door, see if someone's home. If they're not, go on to the next door.
Right.
Right. And when you were missing, your mom called around. It was usually your mom, and said, is Wendy over there? And that was it. Right. And so
or your mom would go out the front door and just
Right.
start shouting your name.
The worst, right?
Wherever you are, you usually were within maybe a few houses, but you'd hear it.
Yeah,
Oh,
and
that's so
I
funny.
really think that, so just like the chickens, like that could leave around and go out, we really had the capability, and I think that the key things for us is that we set our own agenda and we did our own thing from such an early age versus, my kids that are now as of soon will all be in college, and they aren't used to that. They aren't
Mm.
used to figuring out what the day looks like, or figuring out what they want to do, because the society and the life they've been brought up in is very much pre-programmed.
So the second thing you said is we are natural translators.
Yeah, and I think this, for us, we were really the first generation in my mind that was dealing with sort of new technology and new devices coming in. We were, I've been watching the last season of Stranger Things. It's always a fun trip down memory lane, but we were conversant with technology. We
Mm.
tried cell phones. I mean, it's hard for me to even remember my own life without one. And so I think we could talk to our parents about it, right? We talked to our grandparents about it. And so I think in this way, we developed a skill. And especially when I entered the workplace and I was the new kid on the block, we were the ones pushing for some of those new technologies and helping those generations above us really become conversant in it. We didn't just assume it, we had to learn it. And I think it's
Mm.
different than generations like our kids' generations that literally don't remember a time before. We learned it and we had to translate it and we had to make it work. And I think that skill is extremely helpful for us, as I feel like Gen Xers, because we're between, the baby boomers and the millennials, we're like the ultimate middle child,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we've got
Good.
to figure out how to connect those two. And so I think we're really good at translating what that looks like, technology, language, and kind of pushing for new ways of doing things.
And constantly trying to figure out what's the environment in which we're operating. What are the rules? Who are the rule makers? Who are the places of influence? Like constantly assessing. I feel very often that our generation is very good at that, like very adaptable to what's going on. Saying,
Yeah,
"Oh, okay, so here's what we need to be doing now, and here's how we have to be thinking about it," which is the same thing as translating. You're
right.
constantly trying to figure out, what does this mean?
Yeah, exactly. And again, I think that our world was shifting. There was so much technical innovation, in the late 70s, 80s, right? We were getting personal computers. It's hard to remember it
Mm,
all, right? Because it seems funny. But, we got cell phones, we got email, we got internet. And I
that's so true.
remember all of those things, right? And learning how to adapt my life around them. And I think that ability to kind of, and then I got my mom online, right? I was like, Mom, you got to get on this thing,
Mhm.
AOL, right? So I think we became very conversant at figuring out and navigating that change, which, I still think we lived through one of the biggest technical changes throughout time in terms of how people worked. I mean, remember, I was thinking about this the other day. We used to go into work, leave work, and not have anything to do.
Oh, yeah. Oh my god, that's insane.
Right. And we lived through that to now having our work on a little handheld thing that we have everywhere. But we started in a time when that was not the case. And I think that puts us in a really unique position. And actually, with some of the pushback that's coming, help navigate that. Because we remember a time when you went home and you had a life.
Push back, what do you mean?
So when I'm reading a lot about the Gen Zs, right? And I've just been reading a lot of articles, I always do, and younger millennials, they are asking for free time.
Mhm.
They are asking to work at home. And so as, COVID, obviously everybody worked at home, but I think as we're navigating this post-COVID world, we're going to have to think about, they're saying, you know what? I don't want to work a 90-hour week. I want to go hike. I want to be with nature. And honestly, we could have that view like, oh, those kids, they don't know anything. But then I started thinking about my old life, that life that I didn't come home and do email every night. And even if I stayed late, I left all that work there at the office.
It's so true.
And
that's something I never even thought about. That is so spot on.
Yeah. And so I think, again, we have some hope because we embrace this world. And I think Gen Xers really did. We really embraced the technology. We were open to it, right? And we were really moving along. But I think if we think back to our childhood and we think back to even our early working days, we remember that too. And so, just because we have the capability doesn't mean we always have to do it. Yeah. And I think we need to rethink. And I think COVID, everything that's happened with COVID is a great opportunity for us to rethink what that workplace should look like.
That's so spot on. Just because we have the capability does not mean that we need to do it.
Yeah.
And which goes back to what you were saying before, is like, time out. Are we making assumptions through the lens of our own experience and our own way of thinking, or are we asking bigger questions? Do we have this right? Does this work for everybody? Again, it's also the translation.
Exactly.
Translating, well, the business is looking at bottom line revenues and where they have to go. They're looking at human capital. We need the human capital to get us there. You're going to do it this way. Instead of saying, well, wait a second, what is actually this way?
Right.
Do we even have this right?
Right. And I think, again, we've already lived through a lot of change. So why not be open to, again, taking this moment in time? I think we have a unique moment. I think we've seen some amazing things come out of COVID. I mean, I know that sounds strange, but I worked at home when my first son was born. So 21 years ago, I was a complete pioneer in working at home. And I knew for a long time it was a great way to be. It was a great way to be a parent and be involved in different things. But it took a huge major event that I hope never happens again, or I hope goes away, or whatever we're in, to make us realize that. But again, I don't think, and my kids disagree with me vehemently on this, and I've even had a lot of conversations with my students. I don't know that 100% working at home is the right answer either. And I think we have to be very thoughtful as organizations into what that looks like. More flexibility, 100%, 1000%. Do we need to think about things that bring people together? Yes, we do. We cannot be remote solo people working alone either. And so I think, again, we're entering into these conversations about what should work look like. What should our hours be? Just because we work 90-hour weeks, well, I don't know. I don't think that was so good for us.
Oh my God. Right? That's like a whole nother conversation.
That's a whole nother conversation.
That's like a whole nother. But the last thing you said is we're adaptable, which we hit on a little bit, but I'd love for you to expand upon that.
Yeah. And I think, again, we lived through so many different phases of sort of in our development, from, really no technology or little technology into lots of different types of technology. I think that's one. I also think we've been sandwiched between these big, huge consumer groups, baby boomers and millennials. And if you look at marketing people, business are always fixated on the big group, right? So it's like, oh, baby boomers. We got a teeny bit of it. And then it was like, oh, but millennials. So I think we've been stuck between these two big consumer groups that everyone's been talking about. And we've had to sort of figure out our space in that. And that's made us like, sometimes we're kind of on the baby boomer side and sometimes we're kind of on the millennial side. And we're kind of fluid between both because the conversation has not been really about us for a long, long time. The reason I wrote that blog was, and it was a kind of a joke. CNN was talking about the generations and they left out Gen Z.
Oh, so you're kidding.
So it was a graphic of millennials, baby boomers, and then they left out Gen X, not left out Gen Z. So it was baby boomers, millennials, and then Gen Z, no Gen X. But I think that the fact that we're sort of in that weird space has made us have the ability to kind of go between groups. And again, I really think of us like that middle child where I can talk to that older generation. I can talk to that younger generation. I can understand. I remember that working world that baby boomers were leaving when I came in. Right. And yes, there were some things about it that absolutely I'm thrilled have changed. But there were also some things about it that weren't so bad. And I can remember that. And I think I can then convey that down the chain to those younger generations, right? Keep the good. Because I think we're all so quick to say, oh, it was terrible. It was a sexist working environment. It was a racist working environment. And it was all of those things. But it was also some other things that were really great. Right. You know, companies took you out to lunch. You had great holiday parties. You know, you had a moment in the office to kind of chit chat a little bit and get to know who you were working with. And so I think we have to be really careful as human beings. You know, and funny that this is coming from a marketer because marketers stereotype all the time, not to completely stereotype everything about an era or a generation, but really think through what is the good and what is the bad.
Do you think we can successfully teach these attributes to other generations? You know, I'm thinking about millennials and Gen Z. So if we have this unique opportunity to really leverage our innate abilities to really operate in the gray, we are very good in ambiguous situations. That's really what you're hitting on.
Yeah, no, it's great.
But how do we teach that?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, I feel like a lot of my job at Georgetown is giving license to those students to do what they want to do. Right. And we didn't, again, this comes from our free range kids. We didn't ask for permission. We did. Right. We were as you said, I navigated the gray areas beautifully. I was with my boyfriend. If I said I was at my friend's, if my mom called my friend, she would call me, I'd call my mom back. Right. So I think some of it, I feel like a huge part of my job is giving young people the permission that they do know what's going on, or it's okay. No one really knows what's going on. Right. And I think that confidence that we come into a situation with where it's like, oh, it's messy. It looks terrible. I'm just going to figure it out. That's, I think, what we come from, the way we grew up and what our generation did. They come in and they freak out. And I think what I do is parse it down for them and be like, you're fine. You got this. Yeah. Right. And I think that, you know, as a parent, I do that. But I think as a teacher, I do that all the time. Like, no, you know what? It really could be A or B. And either is going to be okay.
It's interesting, too, to even pause and say, what is it you think's happening here? Be an interesting question rather than here's what's happening. Here's how we're going to execute. Here's how we're going to drive the change. It's like, well, why don't you tell me what you're seeing, what you're noticing? And that's a powerful way to teach those translation skills.
Exactly. And again, I mean, think about it. They're a generation, especially if we're talking about Gen Zs, that the answer was literally at their fingertips. It was at Google. To anything.
Yeah.
I mean, in my household, we have a Google Home and we sit at the dinner table and we're fighting about something. And then we'll be like, hey, Google, who founded whatever, right?
Right.
So now what happened when you and I had a question? I mean, we ask
other people. Go ask somebody with more experience.
Right. We asked other people. I mean, maybe we were like so hell-bent. We went to the library. I mean, so we didn't. So we're super resourceful. Right. And so they're like, oh my God, the answer is not on Google. What do I do? Now, the interesting thing about them is they're so smart. They are so smart. They know so much about the world, about society, about history than I ever did. But they're looking for that answer that's going to magically appear in their research.
Right.
And a lot of times I just say, it's not there. Go for it, right? Take your best guess. And I think we're so part of it for us is giving them permission to take the leap of faith. You've done the work. They have way more data about anything than I ever had.
Yeah.
And then it's just like, yeah, you know what? Go for it. Take the leap of faith. And if it doesn't work out, it's going to be okay.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, let's talk about the business world right now, because obviously, again, this is a big part of what you're talking about. What do you think the biggest challenges are that are facing the business world right now?
Yeah, so many. I think it's figuring out the right. I actually think it's a lot on not necessarily figuring out the right markets, because I feel like we're doing that. I think one is figuring out how to get employees engaged and how to structure a company that does that gives flexibility and sort of the things people want working at home, but builds loyalty internally. And, I've talked about this a lot. I think companies have forgotten over years and years of layoffs and all things happening that loyalty is a two-way street. And we're seeing the results of that now with the Great Resignation or whatever you want to call it. I think companies really need to think about maybe companies aren't a lifetime promise, right? When I started working, I started at Lucent, which is a part of AT&T. I saw the last of the lifers, the people that went to work and said, I have a job forever, and I don't think that was right. But somewhere in between that and you could be out of here in a couple weeks. And I think we need to really think about, as companies, our loyalty to our employees. And we cannot expect loyalty if we are not giving loyalty.
Yeah. Well, it's taking that notion of creating brand loyalty with customers.
Right.
Take the same philosophy, and how do you create more of that with the employees?
Exactly. And then I think, the other big challenging, just from a brand perspective, is we are in the noisiest marketplace I've ever seen. And I mean, you think about your daily life, how many messages are you bombarded with in every channel, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, where did I see that? What was I doing? So again, I think less sometimes is more. And I think companies need to think very carefully from a marketing perspective or from a sales perspective or from a business perspective about who do they want to reach and why.
Yeah.
I mean, I love it because, when my students come in and they're working on a project with a client, I teach a class called Capstone. It's the last class. And they work with a real client and on a marketing challenge, and they'll come in and they'll be like, no, but the company said everyone is their target market. And I'll say, okay, well, maybe Coca-Cola could say that, but they also have billion-dollar budgets, right? Everyone is not your target market. You usually have a sweet spot, and then you want to build from there. And I think companies need to think a lot more about who their customer is And how do they get their attention?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, let's think about this now through the lens of academia. And this is a broad question, but of course, I'm very interested in your point of view.
Yeah.
When you think about just academia, full stop, how do you think academia is really readying students, the student population, for the workplace?
Yeah, and I really am a huge fan, and I just said this on an orientation call today. I actually think academia also needs to change. Because I think what we want to build are critical thinkers, resilient students, and I don't know that that's exactly what we're doing in a grade kind of inspired environment. Right. So I would shake it up. I would allow people to, really explore broad interests. And I know that sounds crazy because we're hyper fixated on the skills that are going to help us get a job. And I do that. I teach skills, but I think teaching practices and ways of thinking is going to be way better than teaching you a skill that I know will be outdated at best couple years. Right. So, so when I'm thinking about getting them ready, those are sort of, I think about, really helping them to become better people and bigger thinkers and able to kind of take on these challenges. Because who would have said, if you and I were talking 3 years ago and someone mentioned a pandemic that would put us all in our homes for 2+ years, we would have thought that's insane.
Yeah.
And so, and who knows what the next thing is going to be. And so to create students workers that can deal with the pandemic, climate change, civil disobedience, that's a big thing, right? And I think we saw during COVID, some businesses pivoted amazingly. They made more money, right? And some just straight down the tank.
Right.
Couldn't reimagine the world. So if you think about it, we know that our next generation workers are going to have to be more resilient and more flexible. And yet our schooling is a bit rigid and a bit inflexible right now. So I would say, really open it up, really, really work on themes and ideas rather than sort of these skill sets. I think the other big thing, and I was getting back to this, I said to the students at orientation today, I said, please, in your time at graduate school, take one class that scares the living shit out of you.
Brilliant. That's brilliant advice.
And you know what? It's okay to get a B in it.
Oh my God.
Okay. Because what I also see in younger generations, and I put that on the younger millennials and Gen Zs, fear of failure. Fear of failure. And that is, again, how can you have that in this changing environment? You can't be afraid to fail. You have to keep going forward. So I said, if you hate math classes, kind of strategy, or if you hate budgeting, kind of stuff like that, take them. If not now, when?
Right? Wouldn't it be cool if we don't even use the word fail? We're just going to have a test and learn environment and trust yourself.
Yeah.
It's just trust yourself.
And
way more than you're even giving yourself credit for.
And I think I was talking to one of my adjuncts last week. What I'm seeing in the classroom is, people that I know have an answer and I know have an opinion and I know have ideas that are hesitant to say it because it might be wrong. And so go for it. I don't care. Right. I'm going to support you. And so I think that hampers creativity. I think that hampers those huge, big ideas.
So true.
Big ideas aren't usually safe, right? They're a leap of faith. They're a change. And I think the other thing that I always tell students, and I think all of us could go back to this, watch people, watch the environments that you're in. And I think about my pre-cell phone self. When I'd travel a lot, I would sit in an airport and I would watch everything happening. I'd watch that couple over there, that family having a fight, and I'd make up stories about them. I'd go out to dinner on my own. I'd just sit and watch people. Now I'm so tempted, like everyone else, to play a stupid game, to flip through TikTok, to whatever I do on my phone that I don't need to do. And so I've forced myself to like put away my phone and be in my space and just watch people. It's still the most interesting thing you can do.
So spot on. Again, I could be digging into this and asking you 45 follow-up questions on that. All right, so let's talk about the business leaders, because these are business leaders that are following this conversation. And what could we be doing to be better equipped for the next iteration of the workplace?
Yeah, I think for us, not to make the mistakes that maybe I feel like older generations have made, I think first and foremost, we need to listen to our younger workers as they're coming in. I think and I do this as a parent, it's so easy to dismiss and say, but you don't know because of X, Y, and Z. Or you don't understand because I'm thinking about these staffing issues. I'm looking at my supply chain, right? I think first and foremost, listen and be open to hearing what actually you could change. It doesn't mean we're going to change everything. I still think I don't know if wisdom comes with age. I don't know that I'd call it wisdom, but I'd call it, you've seen things happen a few times and you know things are going to maybe be okay a lot of the time, and you're confident in that. And you know that, you've been around, that you've seen cycles. And so it gives you a sort of perspective that I don't think young people have. But I've also learned that sometimes their perspective, sometimes they've made me question my perspective. And I'll give a very specific example. When things were happening with Brett Kavanaugh and that whole discussion, I was like, oh, whatever. Stuff like that happened to me all the time when I was a kid, a teenager at a party. And one of my younger coworkers said to me, why was that okay, Wendy? And I thought, yeah, why was that okay?
Right.
Things that, and again, things that I had accepted in my workplace experience, that I moved on from, some of them, maybe they weren't okay. And maybe I should have examined my workspace a little bit. Some of them, maybe they were okay. And maybe I can help a younger person think about a different perspective on that. Right. And so to me, the number one thing I think business leaders can do is listen and really open your mind to examine your own beliefs and your own,
even if it's scary.
Even if it's scary.
It's a dark, lonely place, your belief system or how you've been conditioned to see things, still invite it in.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean you have to do what they're asking or doing what they're suggesting, but if you're inviting it in, 99% of the time, it's going to surface a deeper connection, more meaningful conversation, and potentially some bigger ideas that you never even thought were there.
Exactly. And again, what a wonderful opportunity. Multi-generational workplaces are amazing.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, why I love teaching, what you start to lose over time, energy. I love the energy that's coming in, right? I love working with young people who believe they can change the world. And I want to do everything in my power to help them do that, to be a partner with them as we change the world together. I'm not going to tell them everything that they need to do, and I don't expect them to tell me everything that we need to do. I think just like any great team, we bring our unique skills and perspectives and energies to a problem, but I don't think anyone's going to solve it alone.
Yeah. You know, I just thought of something else that I think would be helpful to this question too, which is an extension of listening, is talk about what you're afraid of. And that's multi-generational as well. I mean, it certainly was not the conditioning that we were brought up in corporate America. That was not really an acceptable conversation, but there's so much opportunity to talk about fears and pains and worries and things that are keeping you up on Sunday nights. And I think if we could have the courage to talk about our worries and our fears in a much more open-ended way, that can really fuel a tremendous amount of ideas. And I was just reflecting on this when I was thinking about a client when we started talking about fears and vulnerabilities, and it was bigger than fear of failure. It's fear of success and what that could mean. And what we started to uncover is a lot of the policies, procedures, and even value system was based upon a model that was 15 or 20 years old. And it wouldn't actually have led to any kind of real success down the path. But when we got into sort of the fears and the anxieties, these new ways of operating started to be revealed that were like so much more progressive, so much more interesting, so much more provocative, that created that employee loyalty. But had that leader not have the courage to say, you know what worries me? You know what I'm not sure of? Or even more courageous to say, I made a decision 20 years ago. That was a negative result. I'm afraid it's going to happen again, even though the environment is completely different. But if we can start changing our mindset and having the courage to talk about things that are uncomfortable, I think it can just blow this up, which goes back to, again, the attributes of us Gen Xers.
Exactly. Now it all makes sense. No, and I
think together beautifully.
It all comes together beautifully. And I do think that the other thing that I think this generation, more so than any other generation wants, is authenticity and realness. And again, don't forget, this is a generation that literally grew up bombarded by endless messages from brands. I mean, since they were born, they've been bombarded by messaging. And so they're very skeptical. So that, I think you're 100% right. That opening up, that inviting of the conversation, that showing that, you know what, I've been around the block 20 times and I'm still scared.
Yeah.
And it's okay. I think that this generation is really fearful because they are literally hearing all the time a lot of negativity about the world, about, you know, what's going to, you know, there isn't going to be a world. There isn't going to be Social Security. There isn't going to be whatever, right?
Yeah. Or worse, like, we made all these problems. You guys have to go fix it, which is like such a stupid thing to say. Instead of saying, let's come together and fix this together and actually create something better.
Right. And I think that we actually, again, no generation is going to fix it alone.
Yeah.
Right. The problems are too big. It's going to take new innovative thinking. It's going to be a multi-generational fix. And so let's start listening and inviting those dialogues and bringing in those fresh ideas. And again, I feel it, right? As a parent, I feel it as an educator, I feel it as a professional. You know, sometimes coming out of your mouth is, we can't.
Yeah.
No.
No, but. Yeah.
No, but right. It's like, yes, and. But literally, you know what I do now? I sit on my hands. I literally sit on my hands so that I listen before I jump in with a solution, a judgment, some kind of story I'm going to tell. And I really, truly try to make myself present in the moment. And like you said, that has yielded so many interesting conversations. It's changed my thinking. It's changed their thinking. And together, I think this is what is going to help us rebuild a better work environment. I mean, again, I don't think that you can say there's been some amazing things happening in work and we've seen amazing progress. We still have a long way to go, right? With women, with diversity, but we know we can do better. It'd be a boring world if there was no better. And so let's stop hanging on to our things, the way we did it, the way it was, and let's make room for some new things. And I think we'll find an interesting place for everyone.
Wow, I love that. All right, so here's my last question.
Okay.
You're obviously a very influential voice, not only in the marketing and communication space, but obviously you're playing a big part in a very large academic environment. How do you want to play a role in influencing the future of work?
Oh, it's such a huge question. And I have like 15 billion answers, but I really think I want to make work a place. I want to make work a place where people find their best selves, do their best work, and have fun.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that when I think about and keep growing in their profession and keep becoming a better worker and a better human being. And I think it's as simple as that. I want their work to be meaningful. We spend so much time at work, right? And I want people at the end of the day. I mean, when I think about my job now at Georgetown, I love it. I love every minute of it. I leave my work day and I'm ready to work again. And, I want people to feel that energized and feel like they're making a difference and feel like they're doing their best selves. And I think if we listen and we change and evolve, I think we can do those things.
I'm smiling because could you imagine before every meeting, before you walk in or you hop on a video platform, if you said to yourself, my mantra is to create a workplace where people feel valued and heard and they're putting their best self forward and they're going to grow and learn. Every meeting, if you said that to yourself, could you imagine the type of conversations that would ensue? You would get out of, I have to do this, I have to do that, I have to do this. It would completely change the mindset and the chemistry of the workplace. So I love that we ended there, Wendy. And I feel so grateful that you are in the seat that you are in and that you are shaping some extraordinary minds. And I cannot wait to see what comes next. So I thank you so much for sharing all that you did in this conversation today. And I'm thrilled to bring this to the world.
Thank you. And it was a blast. I feel like we could have gone on for decades.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Warriors at Work show. If you are interested in learning more about what we do at the Warriors at Work show and platform, be sure to go over to my website, Jeanie Coomber, and subscribe to my monthly Warrior Playbook newsletter. I share everything that I'm up to month by month, as well as some lessons and insights that I've learned. I'm also interested in hearing any feedback you have about this conversation or future topics. So reach out to me directly on jc@jeanniecoomber.com or on LinkedIn. Be sure to tell your friends and your colleagues about this Warriors at Work conversation. Subscribe, review, and rate us. It's the best way to get this message out into the world. Be well.